Guess what, friends? This is Homebrewed Christianity, and I am Dr. Tripp Fuller, and you're about to have yourself a good old time. Why? You are headed to a local brewery in the ATL, the Atlanta, Georgia. You will be greeted by friends, alumni, and local homebrewed listeners who gathered together for a live podcast that was sponsored by our friends at McAfee School of Theology. That is indeed the Divinity School of Mercer University, right there in Atlanta. Very cool city, amazing people at the Div School, and as you'll hear tonight, they have some pretty cool profs. We not only talk in the first segment, about the nature of moral virtue and leadership, the reigning problems at the heart of evangelicalism, namely its connection to racism and white supremacy. But then, after we talk with David Gushee and Colin, we talk with Dr. Garber, Hebrew Bible professor, about the connections of reading Scripture, right, in a good way, and reading comic books. We might talk about Neil Gaiman, a little bit of Star Wars, a whole host of nerdy little trinkets. All of this combined in a live setting. So buckle your theological safety belt, because that's about to go down. Before we jump in, a few little tidbits of information. Number one, this is the last podcast intro I'm recording in the United States of America before my family of 5 moves to the United Kingdom, namely to Scotland, where we will be residents in the city of Edinburgh, as I take up a post at the university there. And it's a religion and science postdoc fellowship. Very excited about it. Can't get you really more pumped, especially since I'm mostly, other than visiting Indianapolis this weekend for a number of speaking gigs, podcasts, and all that kind of stuff. I've been packing. I've been packing a lot. And I think we're going to get there. We're going to manage to move to the other country. But let me just tell you how crazy it is. So if anyone ever tells you they're thinking about moving to another country and they've never done it before and don't have a lot of friends that have, they can holler at me and I will give you some advice. Everything takes longer than expected and probably costs significantly more. And ever since Brexit, the United Kingdom has been notoriously difficult at getting new visas. So we're pretty pumped. We have them. We have visas and a job when we get there. We just have to get there, which is its own challenge. So we're going. And that challenge was made significantly better by so many of you that stepped up and helped out. We started a GoFundMe because, one, it's actually just crazy expensive. And we have gotten almost $21,000 in the GoFundMe of the $25,000-ish of expenses we're going to have moving over there. That's the expenses of visas, plane tickets, that kind of stuff, getting there. And so it really, I don't want to get emotional or anything. I just want to say thank you to all of you that gave to the GoFundMe, those that sent, personal checks and stuff because you weren't worried about the tax deduction and things. So, thank you. So, as that gets near to, closing up at the end of the month, I am mostly just shocked and feel humbled, honored, grateful for so many of you stepping up. Really, anyway, I don't want to talk about it now. I'll talk to y'all in person. If you were one of those people, I think I've messaged everybody that gave, and if I didn't, I'd probably sent it to an email I thought was yours, or called you, or sent really weird text videos. A couple of you got some from Cora because she likes sending videos, so she did thank you dances to Old Town Road. Anyway, because she's 5, and that song is so much fun 20 times in a row. All right. Quite a few of you are excited. We're about to start the systematic theology class that'll run throughout the school year. And I've gotten everything for the first 2 almost done. The next time with all the moving craziness that I have the computer for 3 hours and no children are packing, I'll send y'all everything. outline, like calendar, lessons, the first lecture, and all that kind of stuff. Looking forward to it. Anyone's welcome to join. All you have to do is join the homebrewed community, right? And the people are joining it. Like, we've had quite a few new members. I'm super pumped and grateful about it. You can go to homebrewedcommunity.com. It'll be awesome. A number of you emailed me, especially those of you that have been to Theology Beer Camp, which is the homebrewed Christianity event where you take a theology conference, crazy fun parts of a youth conference, and you taste craft beverages throughout it. We've done those events a number of times, and you said, look, you're moving to Scotland, Tripp. Are you going to do a Theology Beer Camp in Scotland? Or maybe a Theology Scotch Camp? Like, I'm just going to say, the volume of you that have reached out about it makes me say yes, but can I got to figure out how that works precisely by moving there. Like, after I get there, I'm sure I'll figure it out because, one, a lot of you are American listeners who I like hanging out with, and I may be lonely. I may be saying to myself, where's someone with a southern drawl when you need one? Or, like, who's going to come from California with significantly dry hopped IPAs and things like that? Like, I may be just longing for your presence intensely, and we'll figure it out. So I've been packing 14 hours today. My brain's a little tired. This is the 5th time I've tried to record this intro because my child played with the knobs because I was hoping he would be occupied while I box things. And when I went to edit it, I found out that I sounded like Darth Vader. This one doesn't technically sound like Darth Vader, even though I don't know how long it'll take me to get all the knobs back in the right place. Which you may be saying to yourself, Tripp, you're a father of 3. Like, haven't you thought about knobs that if they just get moved, it changes things, like marking them? Yeah, I have thought of that. I just didn't follow through with it. One last thing before we start. Jason Oden, who he's recently become, ordained in the Episcopal Church, a longtime listener, member of the homebrewed community and everything. He has gotten a grant to significantly subsidize some Lutheran and Episcopal lay leaders and ministers and things that want to go to the Holy Land, like very, very significantly reduced rate. So the trip he's going on is in March. He got one of those spiritual development, I don't know exactly, grants. He just told me about it, and I said I would mention it on the podcast because I would want to go if I was Episcopal or Lutheran. And so he's like, there's bound to be someone that listens to the podcast who would like to go for an, super cheap price. So anyway, I'll link everything on the Homebrewed website. You should check it out, especially if you're Lutheran or Episcopalian, because somebody in one of those churches that has money is like saying to you, like, can I hook you up? And if I was going to go on a pilgrimage, I'd love to go with Jason because he's a high quality human, loves doing it, has been doing it a long time. And now he's like a real priest, so he's not even faking it when he tells you spiritual things. Yeah. All right. So McAfee live podcast in the ATL. That's what's going down. I hope you enjoy it. I will talk to you when I'm on the other side of the pond. That's right. That's when you shall hear my voice next, unless you're coming to the event this weekend in North Carolina. But if you're not coming to that, or my family or close friends, that'll be the next time you listen to my voice. All right. So until then, thank you. Thank you for listening. Thank you in advance for sharing the brew. And I hope you have as much fun listening to this as I did hanging out with all my friends in the ATL. Peace.
Members here from...
Uh-oh.
Yeah, that's right. We got some church members where I preach on Sunday. So for all those at First Baptist Monroe, we are glad you made the drive here. Welcome. Yeah. Please keep me coming back on Sundays after this.
Oh.
All right. So the School of Theology.
Yeah. So McAfee is a wet Baptist school. so that they would have a gathering and a brewery.
You may want to unpack that a little bit. But that's
Wet
all right,
Baptist,
yeah.
if for those of you that didn't grow up Southern Baptist and then get excommunicated for using your brain and loving your neighbor, the Wet Baptist was a word you use for your Baptist friends who had friends that drank in public. And so Dry Baptist meant you only drank when your Episcopal friends were around.
That's true. That is
Wet
true.
Baptist meant you would drink with a Baptist friend. And I do this at a lot of Baptist schools. Only a few of them would ever do it at a brewery, or last time at Manuel's Tavern. So I feel like that's an ontological distinction that's important to notice.
That's absolutely the point. The point is the whole ontological connecting of all of this. We're being ourselves here. There we go.
I know. It's
All
weird
right.
to tell a minister to use a microphone.
I know.
Telling a theologian to do so is not as odd. A minister, they like getting heard.
We do like getting heard.
I know.
Often.
So McAfee, can you, if people are listening to the podcast, so imagine there are like 70,000 people right now. They're doing dishes, maybe rocking a child back to sleep that has an ear infection, stuck in traffic in Atlanta, or whatever. They're listening to this podcast. They are like, I've never heard of McAfee before. How would you introduce the school?
All right, so when I listen to this podcast, I'm having my quiet time, just me and Jesus.
Well,
and we're downloading Homebrewed Christianity.
Praise the Lord.
Feeling the Spirit there and getting in tune. And there's nothing I like more than to hear a School of Theology just say what we're all about. So at Mercer University School of Theology, which is named after James and Carolyn McAfee, we're a school that, you see our T-shirts, These Bears Preach.
Yeah, everyone on the podcast can see that
sorry.
T-shirt.
I want you to imagine if you're listening by way of your radio device. Yeah.
Radio device.
No, yeah, we're a school that believes in proclamation, and so whether that proclamation takes you behind pulpits, or hospital corridors, or a lectern in a classroom, or counseling session, or just simply better equipping and providing whatever work that you're called in vocationally. At the School of Theology, at McAfee School of Theology, we're invested in you being an informed proclaimer, a thoughtful proclaimer, and one that's not apologetic about the hope that is within you. That's what we do. Yeah.
So you are in the pulpit minister on a regular basis and invested in the future of theological education for the church. So having been a minister and in theological education, at no point did I just say I want to do both at the same time.
Right.
Like they're both high demand things. So there must be a love in you for both the academy and the church to do what you're doing. So
yeah.
When did those two passions kiss?
Well, when my boys left the house because they were empty
just
nesting.
imagine that.
Empty nesting, yeah. But that's because we work together. I know when I was a full-time pastor that both in calling staff, but also in working with, and for that matter, working with this particular School of Theology, it's incredibly important that we invest with each new class, each new generation, as we invest in the future, but also having that pragmatic experience. We're on the field. We're always on the field. There is no I'm a full-time this or a part-time that. We're always invested full-time in this. So, yeah, it's a great marrying for me.
Okay, so Homebrew Christianity, in 3 weeks it'll be our 11th year of a podcast, and
pre-adolescence.
Yeah.
Pre-adolescence.
And so we've had over 1,000 episodes.
Yeah.
And and each week my goal is to interview some of the best from the academy, so that they can bring their wisdom to people that don't go to divinity schools, or lure them into the academy, and so that they can brew their own faith. Because one of the problems, I think, in American Christianity is that they imagine that Christianity is the equivalent of PBR, like Pabst Blue Ribbon. It is technically a beer. It won an award a long time ago.
Cheap.
Yeah, it's not very tasty. That's why you have to serve it very cold. And it's only effective in filling you with the Spirit in high volumes when you're suspended upside down, namely in an outdated patriarchal institution with Greek lettering on it. It's fraternity and or church joke. But luckily y'all aren't Methodists, or it would burn really hard right now. Wow, I didn't plan on that yet. I was saving that for David later. Right. David, I'm going to make a Methodist comment at you earlier. But I say it because we're about to meet David Gushee, who is a faculty but also a committed Baptist and churchman and stuff. So for people listening that don't know David and maybe aren't Baptists and interacted with him before, how would you want to introduce him since you know the man?
Yeah, well,
if we're gonna get some theological ingredients for our earbuds with David.
You know, David's like an IPA, right? He's kind of hoppy. He's got a little bit of edge to him. There can be some complexity to David. In fact, there's a lot of complexity to David. And when you take David Gushee in, it's going to force you to think about what it is you're consuming. So as he's bringing his word in the classroom, or behind the pulpit, or wherever David happens to be lecturing in this world, you're going to meet someone that's going to challenge your neurological taste buds. Now, if I were to introduce David Garber, who will be coming a little bit later, David Garber.
Well, apparently he has a fan club.
Yeah, he does have a fan club. Right,
I know, they already started cheering.
I mean, David is like a porter or a stout. I mean, he brings some solid substance to the matter there.
Yeah, much more complex malt bill.
Well, but he's not. You've got to take him in doses, right? You can't. He's not going to invade your space. He's going to invite you to come to that space. Yeah. So.
Well, I really feel like that there should be a new part of your website where you give beer introductions to all the faculty.
Where is Nathan? Nathan is on that.
Yeah,
he's already working on it.
I'm sure he's excited about it.
We've got a T-shirt already planned.
Awesome. Well, will you join me in welcoming David Gushee and thanking Greg for popping up here?
Should I use this one?
Yeah. Whatever one you want. All right. So say something, David, so we make sure the volume is appropriate.
I have never been compared to a beer, ever, as far as I know. So this is a first. We're off to a good start.
Well, I mean, there are worse things to be compared to.
There are definitely worse things.
Yeah, like sour milk. Like if he was like, David, he's like really good milk a month later. He curdles. When you open him, you think about hurling. But, you know, when you're in a pinch. Like that, I feel like just the comparison, like an IPA, that's high quality.
I'm feeling better already. I really am.
I really feel like that's the type of affirmation Greg brought. David Gushee just finished being your term as president for the American Academy of Religion. So basically what that means is if this interview sucks, I'm never going to get to use my PhD.
Because I control hiring throughout all of higher education.
Yeah, I know.
Yes.
No, the unspoken part of that is if it goes well, I'll get a job. So
that's true as well.
I thought so. You don't break the news to me till we're done. So when you were growing up, at what point did the faith you were handed become something that you were like, you know what I want to do? I think I'd like to publish a couple thousand pages of awesomeness with footnotes and make people read it when they're in classes just wanting to get a degree to baptize somebody.
When I was 4, I was thinking along those lines.
4?
Yeah.
You were 4 and you're like, I think I should try Kierkegaard.
Yes. I want to be a seminary professor and make young people suffer. Yes. Amen. Well, a little more serious answer. I grew up Catholic, and Catholicism is a beautiful faith that I never understood while I was Catholic. Mm-hmm. And I left the Catholic Church when I was 13. My deal with my very Irish Catholic mother was I would go through confirmation and never go back. And she did not like that deal, but that was the deal that I was offering. A few years later, I started dating a Southern Baptist girl, which everyone knows is the best evangelistic method ever devised.
Missionary dating, which is not to be confused, Catholics with the missionary position. They're very different.
Thanks for clarifying, Tripp.
Well, no, I made that comment on a podcast recently, and someone said, why would you have sex to witness? And I was like, no, missionary dating is not the same thing. That obviously is full of purity and goodness.
And The other thing that was interesting about her was that she was not a believer. She was just in this church. So she was a rebel to her tradition as I was to my tradition. But I encountered her church and had a big born-again experience when I was 16 years old. And I write about that in my memoir, Still Christian, available at a store near you.
Well done.
And within 6 months, I was sure I was called to be a pastor. In fact, my high school yearbook, this is real. My high school yearbook says, life goal, to be a Southern Baptist pastor. It worked for a few years and then it didn't anymore. But when I was getting the education for that, I discovered that I loved what they were teaching me, that it was so fascinating that I didn't want to stop at the seminary master's level. I needed to go on and get whatever they had to offer. And so I had to get a PhD. And after that, it was like, oh, there's this thing called being a professor where you are training the people who are training others. And that really, I was like, yeah, that's what I'm supposed to do. I was pretty clear about that by the second year of seminary. And I never really strayed from that. It's been very meaningful, especially when students quake in terror. That's really nice as well. I really like that part.
Yeah, well, I was grading midterms today for a class at Wake Div, and a number of them sent, the paper attached with an email explaining just how painful the process was. And after the second email, I started cutting and pasting a little 1,100-word explanation that the best, if you tell me it was a painful task to write your paper, then I feel like I succeeded, because a theological text that wasn't painful to write was neither about God nor yourself. So it's like encouraging me to make it more painful for the final.
So basically, students don't write notes like that when you turn in a paper. Just turn in the paper. Just turn it in.
You're like, this is really hard. I hope you appreciate it. And I'm like, I worked so hard at it. I was like, you did you?
Yeah.
Well, if I have your attention.
Yeah.
So you said I didn't even understand really the value and depth of Catholicism until I wasn't one.
Yeah.
There are a lot of people that grow up Baptists, Southern Baptists, and leave it for a lot of good reasons, some bad reasons, some just whatever. But what is it about the Baptist expression of Christianity that you think people should pause over before leaving it behind?
I think that it is the interesting combination of the relationship of the individual before God, which is non-negotiable and highly valued, but it is at least generally understood that it must be lived in community. Mm-hmm. So it's this paradox or dynamic of individual in community with inviolable personal conscience, and yet needing a community of people to figure out what discipleship requires, and doing that together. It's not top down, it's more bottom up, but it's communitarian and not just individualistic, at least at its best. I have some people here tonight who are part of my community at First Baptist Church Decatur, who we sit together every Sunday morning. Will you all raise your hand if you're from First Baptist Decatur this evening? Yes. And I was the pastor there for a while and have a Sunday school class, and we're trying to do life together, and we've been doing it unglamorously and sweetly for about 11 years. So anyway, so that would mean then, Tripp, that any version of Baptist theology that says we up here are going to tell you down there what true Christianity is not very Baptist.
Yeah. Well, which is, probably shocking to everyone that isn't Baptist and only has encountered them on CNN, because normally when Baptists talk, they're very confident about their appreciation of hierarchies, namely if straight, white, patriarchal, loving, nationalist men are in charge. And at some point, my experience when I was in LA the last 10 years until this past year, and there's hardly any Baptists, and if they are, they're super fundamentalists. So you hang out with other congregationalists like Disciples of Christ, UCC and stuff. Well, at some point I got tired of answering as a Baptist. Yeah. You know, and I wonder, like, for you, what is the investment in the label and the tradition? What's the part that you want to wrestle back and not get outsourced to Jerry Falwell Jr. and the idolatry patrol?
I think that what's happening with Baptists is part of a broader story.
Uh-huh.
Baptists are just one outpost of Christian right married to the Republican Party and a complete fusion of identities. It is a white Christian nationalist idolatry. It's become increasingly clear with a lot of racism in it and a lot of patriarchy in it, a lot of homophobia in it. And so that's about non-denominational churches. It's about Pentecostal churches. It's about Methodists. It's about Presbyterians. It's not one denomination.
Right.
And my work has rarely been focused specifically on Baptist issues because I've mainly been dealing with, my career really began right at the beginning of the Southern Baptist fight, which was also around the same time as the Christian right got going with Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell and so on. So I've been in that fight since the beginning of my career, and I've always known it to be a national fight, not just a Baptist fight.
Well, in one of the legacies in Baptist life, I remember this being told to me. I was just like an infant, but during the takeover and like my dad's PhD advisors all got fired. So then we're living in a state and that we're not there for a reason. And so like there's a group of Baptists who the breakup, is extremely personal, right? And they have their own trauma and experience to deal with it. And then you have all the next couple generations. And to me, one of the things, having been on the West Coast and coming back, is to see that there are individuals who are still excited about the larger Baptist legacy, the free church tradition, and are insisting that there's an expression of the Baptist faith that addresses white supremacy, that addresses homophobia, that insists that the gospel includes good news about our ecological crisis. And at the same time, you can actually read the Bible and pray at night without crossing your fingers. Yeah. Right? Like, having spent a lot of time with progressive mainline Protestants, that's the part that my piety never quite took with. So how do you pitch the endangered species of Baptists that a lot of us in the room might feel ourselves being, and the energy and growth in that part of the church?
I think we're actually incarnating this transition at the Mercer University School of Theology, because the school was founded 23 years ago now as an exile project of moderate Southern Baptists.
Yeah.
It was a Southern Baptist exile project. And when I started here 12 years ago, it still had that vibe to some extent. But now that story is in the rearview mirror. We're not educating 23-year-olds who care about what happened in 1979. Well, they want to know what life-giving Christianity looks like for 2025 and 2040. Yeah. And I do think denominational distinctives will matter less, and we are going to be in alliance and coalition with everybody who's doing something like what I call kingdom ethics Christianity. Mm-hmm. By the way, we have a Kingdom Ethics podcast that I want to tell you about.
It's a plug. Kingdom Ethics podcast. Check it out. Check it out. It's a plug. Kingdom Ethics podcast. That was free. They didn't even pay extra for that. Yeah.
Jeremy Hall. Where's Jeremy? Jeremy has organized this. It is the top-ranked ethics podcast in the world, or something like that.
Yeah.
Somewhere in there.
That's right, Stan.
Okay.
Stan Hauerwas, you suck. You getting beat by David Gushee.
Anyway.
And for other reasons, too.
So
there's no need to go Catholic.
So what I'm saying is this. We need to be, and I'm not listening to you anymore, Tripp. Anyway, we need to be.
Good job.
Listening to whoever is doing creative justice-oriented, reign of God advancing work anywhere in the church or in Christendom, you might say, or ex-Christendom. And so a good seminary is going to be listening to people of all denominations and no denomination, the most creative theological voices and church leaders. And we're going to bust out of denominational bubbles because we need to. And our student body is increasingly becoming more diverse. And also at McAfee, we're discovering the great unresolved trauma of Baptist life in the South, Christian life in the South, goes way back before 1979. It's the trauma of race and racism that is the founding trauma of religion and culture in the South and in America. And now with a 53% African American student body, we are living the process of reconciliation and a better future. So I think the future of the church looks multiracial, and it's going to get beyond. If it's about how many white people can we attract to our church, that's a path of death. It's about how many people who want to follow Jesus can we attract to our church, and are we able to bust out of our racial silos? And we're working on that at Mercer right now.
So when
you can clap, that's good.
What was it Jeb Bush said? Laugh now. Laugh now. One of the things I was interested in is your time in leadership at the American Academy of Religion, the guild for religion scholars across religious traditions, outside of religious traditions. What are some of the questions that are emerging there that you in the classroom, in your work in the church, think we need to start taking seriously and wrestling with in the church? Like, what are the questions the Academy is putting on our agenda that if we don't think about them now, we're going to get left behind?
Well, the American Academy of Religion is an amazing organization to be president of. It has something like 8,500 members of people who teach religion all around the world. One thing we discovered is that there are a lot of people who teach religion who grew up in religious contexts but no longer practice. So there are a lot of people who are fascinated by religion but wouldn't consider being in church, but they might like to teach about it. That's not who we have teaching at Mercer, but it is a lot. So the endless interest in religion is a global phenomenon.
Yeah.
And a lot of the people who teach religion are veterans or refugees of actual religious communities.
Yeah.
Also, the questions about diversity are very acute in the American Academy of Religion. Not just black-white diversity, sexuality, gender, every kind of ethnic group, and intersectional kinds of distinctions and combinations as well. So it makes me feel like when I go into a church that is overwhelmingly monoracial, it feels like a dinosaur to me. When you go to the American Academy of Religion, it's just not like that. And that's generally true in the modern academy. There are contexts in which the diversity of America is just present every day. Mm-hmm. And a lot of our churches are not such contexts. And that's, I think, very worrisome. But in the AAR, that is what it's like. I would also say the idea that scholarship, there's an argument about whether scholars exist just to churn out academic papers for other scholars to read, or whether they exist to make a constructive difference in the world and in religious communities. And I've been in a line of presidents in the AAR, which has included Serene Jones of Union and Eddie Glaude of Princeton, and now Lori Patton of Middlebury, all of whom believe that religion and religion scholarship should be about trying to make the world a better place too. So that's one of the arguments that we saw in the AAR as well. Mm-hmm. The AAR meets concurrently with the Society of Biblical Literature, which is another 8,000 scholars or so. And so when all those scholars get together, that's a lot of nerd power really in one place, and a lot of really thoughtful people. And by the way, you don't have to be a PhD to go to an American Academy of Religion or SBL meeting. You ought to consider going. It's in November every year.
And this next year it's in San Diego. So I don't know about you, but one of my theological commitments and absolutes is God's everywhere, but is definitely in San Diego. Like, when in doubt, if it's in San Diego, say yes.
Seriously?
Oh, yes. I moved back to the South after being in Southern California for 10 years, and you can't wear jeans and a T-shirt every day and grill 300 days a year. It's painful.
It is. It's just not just.
I know. Like, so the problem of evil.
Yeah, there it is.
So, you just published a new book, Moral Leadership for a Divided Age, and you did so with a student at McAfee, a special student, and I want you to tell us two really cool things about Colin that he would be uncomfortable after he got up here that got shared.
Imagine a seminary student with the intelligence, with the writing experience, with the diligence and the discipline, to crank out an award-winning book while being a student full-time and while falling in love. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Colin Holtz.
While falling in love. That's what I'm talking about. You got to turn this mic on. Okay.
We won an award?
Yes, top 10 books of the American Academy of Parish Clergy for 2018. That award has just been announced.
You know,
thank you.
When I was a kid growing up in Syracuse, that's really all I dreamed of.
Man. Like, so you feel like you're just ready to tap out for the night?
I'm done. I mean, 33 years old, I've accomplished my ministry.
Wow.
That's never happened before.
Okay, for those of you that haven't read the Bible, Jesus...
Not making that comparison, let's be clear.
Well, never mind. Okay, this is a total you grew up evangelical aside. I said, you're going to tap out. You make the 33-year joke. I immediately think of Carmen the champion. Like tap out, like boxing, where Satan and Jesus box is like 10, 9. No, you're counting wrong. 8, 7. That, obviously, not enough people in this room went to Carmen concerts. Oh, yes, I see those hands. Carmen was, before he hit the tanning bed and became a Trumpster, he produced very bad theological dramas.
Oh, Carmen. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, later, after the boxing one, he did a Western saloon song where demons got in a gunfight with the Lord. Jesus packs heat. You didn't know that. The Jewish one didn't, but somehow the American Evangelical one has a 6-shooter.
Yeah, I have no idea what y'all are talking about right
I know,
now.
you're from Syracuse. It's not even a Christian country. We're in the South. So, Colin, how did you end up at McAfee? Like, what was the occasion where you said, adult life adjustment, divinity school sounds great?
So I ended up in a Baptist church the way most of us do, which is we're looking for a gay-friendly, LGBTQ inclusive church in our neighborhood, and it ends up being Baptist.
As one does.
Yeah. So that's a pretty common story.
Unlike the Methodists today.
Yeah, we all got our struggles. Their trauma will be, in the future, unfortunately. But I am praying for my friends in the Methodist Church tonight, and we prayed for them on Sunday. No, I wandered into a Baptist church because it was near my house, and it was welcoming and affirming, which is not a very common story. And it turns out I went to introduce myself to the pastors, and they went to introduce themselves to me because it was their first day. So we sort of grew up in this church together and got to know each other. Up until that point, I walked into that church essentially having finished a journey which started out from being a militant atheist to maybe believing there might be some sort of divine force like Star Wars in the universe,
Amen.
to maybe thinking, okay, this might be some sort of theistic godlike force, to eventually coming around to this whole Jesus thing and making my peace with that, and showed up at this church realizing I need some sort of community to be answering these questions with. And fast forward a few years, and I met a number of personal crises and was really finding my work unfulfilling. So I spent about 10 years in politics in D.C., and after experiencing backbiting and factionalism and partisan sniping and rumor campaigns and innuendo, I thought, okay, now I'm prepared to join a local church. I've got the experience necessary. So, I was actually sitting in a bar, not drinking. I was sitting in a bar.
Preserve your witness.
Yeah, I trust me, that's done long gone. I was sitting in a bar and with an atheist friend of mine, and she said, "Look, you will not shut up about this Jesus guy. Will you just go to seminary already?" So here I am. I put out the feelers to a variety of different schools, and this was the one that my pastors had gone to, and so they kicked me down to McAfee, and here I am.
So if you are a prospective student here, it's kind of like the ancients bench of theological education decision. That was a Great Awakening historical reference. During the Great Awakening, there's an ancients bench during revivals where all those that were expecting the experiential encounter of the Holy Ghost to verify your chosenness, they sat there. And so, the prospective students are obviously there. What's the student experience of being at McAfee? Like, what are the questions, passions, and things that you bring that you see students here really seizing on to? Like, you're like, if this is what your thing is, these are the type of people that will dig McAfee.
It's people who are looking to challenge themselves intellectually and theologically, to explore new ideas of a God who's always changing and always emerging in new ways, whose glory is expanding and growing, and who we're understanding in different ways. You will have trouble if you're locked into an idea of God that you grew up with, and you're not willing to at least say, I want to figure out what parts of this that I grew up on are my own and that I hold to with my own mind and my own heart, and which parts are just, they were handed to me and I don't want to let them go because they might fall to the ground and shatter and then I'll feel bad. I was blessed because the nature of my journey meant that I came into school having done a lot of this work, right? I started out not believing in God, and I had to answer all these questions like, can we really believe this book that's like 2,000 years old and all these documents have been gotten passed around? And what do we do about science? And what do we do about the problem of evil? If you're already a believer, or if you don't believe anything and you want to go to a place where you can ask those questions and ask them of people who don't maybe look like you or don't come from a similar background to you, hey, I got a good place for you.
Awesome. So y'all worked on a book, and it's talking about moral leadership, but the context is a divided age. So both of you have very different backgrounds, but it came together in a book. How would each of you describe our divided age, and what kind of ideas that normally get tapered on top of that discussion do you want to deconstruct and pull off?
We're talking about the book, ladies and gentlemen, that's called Moral Leadership for a Divided Age. If you are at home, this book is available at a fine bookstore near you.
It's also on that table over there.
It is, and we're happy to sell it to you and sign it for you. First of all, let me just say, I have written with students before, and I think Colin is now the third generation, maybe the fourth generation of students that I have edited or written a book with. And in every previous case, they were also master's students. So it is possible to publish as a master's student, but you generally need a partner, right? Mm-hmm. There are master's students who do self-publishing, Please don't. I mean, you can, but it doesn't matter in the real world. So just don't. Okay? All right. Okay, moving on.
What if you have a pen name for your fantasy fiction?
Yeah, I mean, you can do that, but anyway, let's talk about this book. All right. I have been teaching a class on great moral leaders since the late 90s. And I think it's an important way to teach ethics. That's my field. Because I think people learn by inspiration. This book covers people like Malala and Mandela and Martin Luther King and Bonhoeffer and Ida B. Wells and Harriet Tubman and people like that. And people want to know what a good life looks like. And we can articulate principles all day long, but the best way to learn what a good life looks like is to see one. And so this is a book that has 14 examples of a good life committed to a transcendent cause that made a difference. The Moral Leadership for a Divided Age points to the fact that in America right now, we can't agree on shared leaders of any type. I don't know that it has always been this way. In fact, I'm pretty sure that it hasn't. There have been people who hated whoever the top leaders were at any given time, but this kind of 50-50 split, and also the politicizing of who we think of when we think of leaders. So there are 33% of Americans who think that Donald Trump is the greatest leader in America right now, and about 50% who think that's an appalling idea. And there are 33% who think Hillary Clinton was the inspiring leader of our era, and 50% who don't, or whatever. These leaders emerged from different contexts. They were journalists and lawyers and activists and theologians and church people and ministers, and they were grasped by a cause, and they made a huge difference with that cause. And we remember them as some of the greatest people in the history of the world. I'm wanting to know, if we retrieve some of these great leaders, might we be able to recognize what leadership looks like again, instead of defaulting to our left and right politics?
Mm-hmm. So, Colin, you came out of politics. Was being on the inside, does that make you more or less cynical about the nature of our divided age?
Both more or less cynical. I'm more cynical because I've tried almost every single way I can think of to make a change in this world, and I keep sort of stumbling into a brick wall and finding something else. So I've tried to get good people elected. I've found them facing only bad decisions. So I've tried to change the public policy options on the table, and then I've run into, okay, well, there's a media environment we need to shift, and so I've done media campaigning, and we actually need to shift the cultural environment that informs the media environment. So, okay, we're going to work with artists, we're going to do cultural transformation, and eventually I just ran into the point that we're incapable of seeing the face of God in each other. And so this former atheist wakes up one morning and thinks, oh, geez, not only do I need to go to church, I need to get other people to go to church in order to fulfill my goals of doing sort of radical, crazy stuff, like having no one, die in poverty in the richest nation on the planet, no one feel excluded and miserable because of who they are and who God created them to be. These sort of crazy things, we actually need to go to church, even though it was the religious right that turned me off to church in the first place. So that was a piece where I grew more cynical. I'm less cynical because none of these jokers are as competent as you think they are, right? So everybody's convinced that there's some grand conspiracy on the right and on the left, and these folks are making it up as they go along. I mean, they're making a mistake, and then the next day they're trying to fix the mistake they made yesterday. So whenever you hear somebody like, oh no, this plan is all coming together, it's like, no. Imagine the person who is going to war over your deacons meeting. These guys, when they get elected to Congress, is the same people. So don't expect that they've suddenly become geniuses just because they've got a button on.
That's they also have nukes. That's so. when you think of moral leadership and the human predicament, how has that changed the way you see humanity and the nature of human brokenness?
Oh, small question. I would say that the great moral leaders get grabbed by some area of human brokenness, and it will not let them go. And they are going to invest their life, even to the point of death, in attacking that area of human brokenness. So I think the biblical picture of human nature is verified again. The capacity of human beings to be deeply morally beautiful, and the capacity of human beings to be wretched. And the moral leaders are those who get, just gripped by the desire to attack some area of sin like slavery or sexism or whatever it might be, and to go to the wall for that cause. So to me, it inspires me in a great way about human nature.
Mm-hmm. So when you're writing this book, you're picking 14 people. When you were going back and forth on who gets included and who doesn't, who's the person that after writing the book, you're like, I can't believe we thought they might not make it?
I think it's easier to say the person who we were sure would make it until we did further research, and now we're less sure.
Oh.
And do you know who I'm thinking of, Colin? Ghandi. Ghandi was on everybody's moral leader list from when people heard about him in 1920 in India, but now we know about some sexual misconduct that is really problematic. I'll be in Macon tomorrow with my undergrads, and we're talking about Ghandi, and I'm concerned it's going to be a bloodbath down there. How could you include Ghandi in this book? And so that raises an interesting question. Can a person be morally exemplary in one area and disastrous in another? Sure they can. But to get on this all-star team of 14, there's only so many people we could include, so maybe we should have bumped him for somebody else who didn't have as much ambiguity. Hopefully we'll have a second edition or maybe a second volume and we get to add some more, or take out. But I do think that Ghandi is one of our ones that I think is going to be interesting to see how people wrestle with that.
Every time he says second edition, I feel like this, moment of anxiety, and I'm still having flashbacks of writing the first one. If you want to flip the question around, I think there were people who we wanted in the book from the beginning, so it's not really a matter of who we're debating. But American history is not super interested in having Harriet Tubman in this book. America today is not super interested in having Ida B. Wells Barnett in this book. And that's because if you're going to have Harriet Tubman, you need to talk about slavery. If you're going to have Ida B. Wells, you need to talk about lynching. And we don't want to talk about any of those things. We want to consider brokenness a matter of, who people sleep with or whether they broke some rule, and only the rules that we particularly care about and not some that have to do with shellfish or something like that. Only the ones that bother us. And so we don't want to look at the deep systemic sins because that might make us realize that we're still living with that and that we've never really escaped it. And then studying Ida B. Wells' life might actually force us to have to look in a mirror and change something about how we live and the choices we make. And so American history isn't interested in those people. And so you could write, a whole book of 14 people that we didn't have time to do of just the folks that America had no interest in putting into books of moral leaders.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that came up to me in it, and I was interested, I didn't know when timeline it worked, but Romero has recently become an actual saint. And how did his own story and that whole process, how does that thinking about the question of becoming a saint and things change the way you think about his story? And then given our current situation about the, in scare quotes, literally scare quotes, invasion from the South, namely including people that Romero would have baptized, end quote. How does that reframe the way you tell his story?
By the way, I think this is a great way. Studying great moral leaders is a great way to enter the study of history as if it matters, because it does. Romero was a fascinating figure. It was Colin's idea that we should kind of elevate Romero into the book, and now I'm really, really glad that we did. He was a perfectly typical conservative Catholic cleric until the suffering of the poor in El Salvador and the suffering of priests who were dying alongside the poor and on behalf of the poor at the hands of government death squads, when it finally gripped him. And that was only in the last 3 years of his life. The last 3 years. And as Archbishop of El Salvador, he ended up being utterly courageous, the pastor of his people, standing against the people who were exploiting and murdering his people, even though he knew it was going to lead to his death, probably. And you know who trained a lot of the paramilitaries that killed the people in El Salvador? It was the United States of America. And so it is immensely instructive to watch his journey. By the way, he shows me something about being a pastor. He was a pastor.
Yeah.
And he said a pastor shepherds his flock. One thing he did in his sermons, he read the names of everybody in his community who had been murdered in the previous week and said, we demand justice for this person and this person and this person. That kind of thing gets you killed. By the way, our immigration problem is still related, out of El Salvador, is still related to the forces that were unleashed during that time. And the United States has its fingerprints on that. So we shaped the modern history of South America, Latin America, Central America, and then when refugees come our way, we shut the doors to them. At least now we are. And so, anyway, studying Romero helps us understand today's headlines in a way that we would not have known how to make sense of them.
So, Colin, when you got recruited for this project, what was the biggest takeaway you learned, and getting to work with your professor, digging into each of these figures, and if you were going back to your politically engaged self, you're like, if you knew this story, this insight, that this might reframe the way you see what you're doing.
It's a new way to begin a conversation, which is fundamentally the thing we're incapable of doing these days, is having a common framework in which to even begin a conversation. You could post an article in your news feed, and you're no longer talking about whether or not that problem has a liberal solution or a conservative solution. You're debating, is it a problem? You're debating, is that fake news or not? You're debating, is that even an acceptable outlet? You're debating, is that an acceptable set of premises on which to base an article? So we've lost somewhere in this process any sort of common ground in which to even engage in conversation. And there's been a beautiful element of that, because it's been this explosion of different narratives and voices that have been silenced too long, but it's also been this very discomforting and disquieting thing that's happened in society, where we're not sure what our common basis for conversation is. And we're wrestling with those things. And I think I would go to my political self and say, okay, well, instead of bashing people over the head with why they're wrong about these issues, because how do they just plainly not see, why don't we look at somebody who was really, really good on one thing and couldn't see something clearly in front of their face in another? John Paul II looked at totalitarian governments and he saw them in his own context in Europe and stood against them in an unequivocal way. He looked across the ocean at Oscar Romero, and all he saw was, okay, are these people's groups who might be aligned with communists, or are they not part of the totalitarian government. And so he ended up almost siding with totalitarian governments because he was embedded in his context. And so there's an insight there where we could say, okay, I admire this guy for this reason, you admire him for these reasons, he did some stuff wrong, got other stuff right. Now we're having a conversation, we got a basis for discourse.
Mm-hmm. Can I say, I'm struck by how fun it is to teach this material. I teach it to college students and seminary students, and right now, it's like a free-for-all as the students discover history in a way they hadn't before and discover inspiration in a way they didn't even know they needed. And so I think I hope this will catch on. It's being used as a textbook in different schools, and I think it's an exciting way to change the way we have conversations about issues.
So my last question, I want both of you to answer it. My buddy Andy, we were best friends in high school. I recently moved back to where I grew up. He's Jewish, like conservative Jew, not like conservative politically, but conservative Judaism, which is like mainline Protestantism. And I was talking to him because he saw the book laying out, and he was like, "Where's Heschel at?" You know, and I was like, well, I don't know. Actually, it's not all Christians. So, like, I was trying to come up with that. But then he said, I was like, well, I'm going to talk to them next week. What should I ask? And he goes, obviously, you should just ask them, what question are you going to ask potential presidential candidates so that their moral leadership skill shows up? Because who the hell knows what they're going to deal with when they're president? But you should at least have a question where they either have to fake it or make it on being moral. And I was like, that's great. I'm going to steal it. But I attribute it to him because as a Christian, I always footnote Jewish thinkers. It's called the Bible. But I do think it is important to think about how our contemporary situation in a divided age, what are the questions where your actual leadership could be revealed if we ask? So if you were both sitting there and they hollered at you and they're like, oh, Mercer's going to host one of the Democratic presidential debates or whatever. What question does our ethicist team that just published moral leadership so we can feature your book and increase your sales want to ask all these candidates? What's Colin and David want to ask?
I'd ask them, what part, it'd be a two-part question.
But you can get that because you're like schools hosting.
Oh yeah,
the debate.
no, I mean we have complete power over the presidential candidates at that point, right? Yeah. There's going to be like 82 of these debates, and there's going to be more candidates, so we'll have plenty of time. I would ask them what part of your own life and your own life story do you feel that it is important to remember, even though you would rather forget it? Oh. And what part of American history do you feel is important to remember, even though you'd rather forget it? Because a huge part of this story of moral leadership is not like this principle in this moment.
Yeah.
It's about how do we remember rightly and remember with texture and nuance and remember the things that maybe we don't really want to remember, but maybe by studying these amazing lives, we can find a way to explore even with our hearts open to uncomfortable truths.
Oh my goodness. I just want you to know, David, if that was my student, I would take credit for it and not say anything. But I know you're the world's most interesting theological ethics professor and president of the American Academy of Religion. So you have your own question you'd ask, but I feel like I congratulate myself because, that was pretty excellent. High five, Colin.
Yeah, all right.
I feel like all of us should tweet it when CNN pretends it cares about what its viewers like. Because no one that watches CNN really wants the guy that we all know is lying to say what Trump wants him to say. But yet he gets a third of the time every time. And I say he because it's always a he. Nonetheless, that's CNN and it's its own, experience.
Let me just say I'm incredibly proud of Colin and also like students who are so well formed when you get them, but you have a chance to kind of help them get to the next step. So here's what I would ask. What group of suffering people in America or the world are you most concerned about right now? And what policy proposal would you make that could concretely address the issues that they face?
Oh, yeah. You want to know what's funny? Is if any of us asked our actual minister at our church similar questions, you would get a lot of the members looking at you like, why are you concerned about those things? We were just trying to make sure the organ worked.
Which is crazy because literally the whole idea of Christianity was, hey, there's this thing that we would rather forget because this guy got killed, but we're going to remember it because it means something to us and it reshapes the entirety of how we understand our lives. So we're this remembering faith, not this ideological faith, and yet people have such short memories. It drives me crazy.
Dear God, if you don't have Twitter and haven't used it to say we're remembering faith, not an ideological faith, that's like high-quality tweetable material right there. And as someone that grew up a pastor's kid, you just start having conniptions once someone brings that up to you because you're like, but I also like health insurance. When you were describing your, like, return, like I grew up atheist, then, like, I might have a God, then it might be a force or whatever. I thought, like, your autobiography should be called Force Sensitive. I know, because, you know, one, I love Star Wars.
I think I have a ways to go before I can publish an autobiography. Currently, if you look at the book on Amazon on your phone, it says, the way it's formatted, it says Moral Leadership for Divided Age by David Gushee and one more. So I call it the world's most accidentally honest byline. So thank you for the title, but I think I got a ways to go before anyone's interested in Force Sensitive by one more.
Well, if everyone would give a hand to David and one more, and invite Dr. Graber up. Well done. There are 38 return guests to the podcast, and now you're the 39th.
Oh, no pressure.
But before we jump into how being a comic book nerd can actually help prepare you to not suck at reading the Bible, that's not the way you described it, but don't worry. When did you realize your relationship to Scripture could be professional and not just spiritual?
I would say I realized that my first year of college. I had a teacher who showed me the texts that I'd never looked at, you know, growing up in a fundamentalist Baptist background. And she was a church historian who taught the Old Testament class for the freshmen at the university. And just seeing her open those texts up to me made me realize that I was somebody who wanted to be a music minister of all things. That's a good pausing point. You wanted to be a music minister? I wanted to be a music minister, yeah. So that tells you a little bit about myself already.
Children's choir was it the hand motions or was it the harmonies?
No, it was, you know, the paycheck really that drew me. But I realized in that class that my interest is really in making meaning out of Scripture.
Yeah.
And also investigating those things that my church never told me. I had the Obi-Wan Kenobi moment, and where I was like, why didn't you tell me what's going on here? Why am I reading all these texts that I've never read before? And they're telling me a lot of different things about God. And so why do I need to hold on to these texts and claim the relevance of all Scripture? So that's kind of where I started this journey. Yeah.
So when you welcome a brand new collection of first-year students who are about to read, technically, if they follow your reading outline for the class, which all the best students do.
Sure.
All these parts of the Hebrew Scriptures they've actually never read before. They just knew existed because they memorized the books of the Bible.
Right.
Like, what are the elements of that experience that you enjoy most introducing people to?
Honestly, it's the sense of wonder about God and the sense of wonder about creation in Genesis from the get-go. I mean, it's a pretty good reading list when you get to start with the book of Genesis.
Oh, yeah.
And you've got all of this drama, all of these different understandings of God in the book of Genesis, God almost growing as a character in the book of Genesis, and seeing their sense of wonder and surprise at some of the texts that they're reading again for the first time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So today you lectured in class about how comic books
Yes.
can help people understand the Bible. And when I was talking to Nathan about tonight, and he said that was on your agenda, after I finished tearing up because of my genuine love for comic book culture, nerd culture, and how indeed nerd culture does understand how to have sacred and authoritative texts that are open to the experience of the community that reads them. Praise the Lord. In a non-hierarchical way of saying the word, the Lord. Like, I understand how comic book nerds are like, that's what I'm talking about. This is the greatest thing I've ever taken out student loans to do. But if you're not a comic book nerd, and then all of a sudden Sandman's on your syllabus, which, okay, let's just pause. Who's read Sandman? Okay. Oh, everyone that just raised their hand is, well, it was on the syllabus, but everyone hadn't taken the class. If you are going to do your first dip into comic books, Neil Gaiman's Sandman that's like reading the Gospel of Luke. You know, there's lots of Gospels, but then you're like, which one's awesome? You're like, it's the social justice gospel one, but also is inclusive of the Gentiles. And when it gets to the hardcore passages, there's woes. When you're introducing comic books in that context, like, what's the invitation or the lure to take them seriously for spirituality, religion, and thinking about sacred texts?
Well, I frame it in a couple of ways. The first is I kind of talk a little bit about how our culture is moving in this post-Christendom world, moving away from religious experience. You mentioned in California they want you to talk about philosophy and whatnot. And I would just so I kind of start there and talk about the rise of the nuns, the NONES, right, or the spiritual but not religious category.
Yeah.
And I think about that in terms of how in many ways the culture is picking up on the moral reasoning, if you want to go back to the previous conversation, is picking up on the narrative storytelling that the church has often abdicated, that we've given up on telling the stories. And it's that the culture is picking up on those things and speaking out prophetically on those things in ways that the church is not.
Well, and I want to pause there for a second just so everyone knows how profound what you just said is. Paul Tillich, Theology of Culture, he kind of developed it coming out of Schelling, 19th century German, and he recognized that the narratives that culture is obsessed with are ones in which the anxieties that are unspoken in the populace are given weight, right? And what comic books are doing right now that they're mainstream and blowing up box offices and everyone goes to them, and then they have to decide if they're voting for them for Best Picture because everybody in the United States went to see them, and you're explaining to them that no, Black Panther's been awesome for years. And you're in that situation because the actual stewards of dominant culture have stopped asking the questions that we're culturally anxious about. And humans have always supplanted their anxiety that first emerges evolutionary out of their biological anxiety with death. But then once we have symbols, signs, stories, narratives, it explodes culturally. Well, if you want to repress that, you tell stories that touch that nerve without admitting to it. So you talk about narratives that touch that nerve where you don't have to admit it's about being born to suffer and die. Or, since you're in Atlanta, a story where you're born into a world and no matter what you do and how beautiful you live, you're walking dead. Because neoliberal capitalism is having you exploit the planet and the poor, even if you're the most progressive person or the most conservative person. And the thing that drives you nuts when you go to bed at night is the difference between you and Jerry Falwell Jr. and yourself is a pool boy.
Tripp,
he paid off his pool boy, like, for sexual reasons. But Google it now.
Tripp, that was such a wonderful moment that I think we need to give Dr. David, a moment to process. If you have a car parked far at the end of this road, there's a tow truck out there. You might want to go check on that.
Do you know what kind of car it is?
It's a white tow truck.
No, not the tow truck. Oh, my goodness.
Right now, it sounds like it's my dad's Sierra.
Could be. A Sierra?
If they tow my car, do I get a free beer?
Yes. Well,
Dr. Garber, you're on.
All that to say that when you go to read, when you start to read comic books, and the way they've gone mainstream is that they are actually giving an outlet to the questions culture's asking we don't have the courage to answer, which is Tillich's, like, what does culture do? It knows how to ask a question it doesn't want to answer. And when you think of Hebrew literature, there's so many questions we're asking again outside of Christendom that the Hebrew Bible asks.
Right. Yeah, and so when I talk about it, when I frame it, I steal a phrase from Neil Gaiman, which is comics are the gateway drug to literature. And I just extend that and say comics are the gateway drug to biblical literature. And I think of this in, well, let me share it in terms of an experience. I came late to comic book nerddom, as surprising as that may be to some of the people here. And I didn't start reading comic books until around 2011, which was the big DC Comics New 52 relaunch of their whole series. And so when I started reading then, there were 3 issues of comics that came out that all had references back to the Hebrew Bible.
And what are they?
So one was Action Comics #1, which is, if you know Action Comics, it's the Superman comic. And, all the Superman, or the last 3 Superman movies that have come out, going back to Superman Returns, have always focused on kind of Superman as the Jesus figure. Well, in Action Comics #1, they return to the original roots of Superman, who was written by 2 Jewish authors. And they talk about his name, Kal-El, the voice of God. And they talk about his name, Jor-El, or his father's name, Jor-El, which is God lifts up, right? And so they talk about these kinds of tropes. And they, instead of thinking about Kal-El or Superman as a new Jesus figure, now they're returning to talk about Kal-El as more of a Moses figure. So we all know the story, the myth of Superman, that Krypton is being destroyed and Superman's put in a spaceship and sent to Earth and adopted, a true immigrant, right? The immigrant narrative. And, he's put into this basket, basically, and sent down the river. And even when you're reading kind of the commentary in the back of the issue #1, Rags Morales, who's the artist, and Grant Morrison, who's the writer, they talked about how they wanted to depict the spaceship.
Yeah.
And, Grant Morrison said, well, I'm thinking about it as the ark that Moses was put into and sent down the river in. And so Rags Morales says, I'm going to draw it a little bit more baskety, right? That's his term. Draw it more like a basket. Right. Yeah. What's that?
Oh, it was like baskety.
Yes.
Good adjective.
Yeah. So they're recognizing that they're drawing on these tropes. In the same week, a reissue of Swamp Thing #1 by Scott Snyder came out.
Oh yeah.
And the title of it was Dim Bones, or Dim Dry Bones. And it has a full page spread, which is kind of the resurrection of Bones, which eventually becomes the kind of evil character that fights the Swamp Thing. And it is a reversal of the Genesis story. And you get the resurrection of the bones and the Ezekiel story. You get the resurrection of the bones and you get this kind of repeated phrase, not good, not good, not good. And so they're very intentional about trying to recreate or draw on these biblical tropes. in order to kind of think about their story in a new way. Yeah.
Well, and I think one of the things that you're observing is how even though our context has changed and now we're aware of how many different cultures have been human in different situations, the questions humans ask together when they get around the campfire at night have not significantly changed. It's like, what does it mean to be human? What's good? What's bad? Right. Like, what is beautiful? What is true? Like, how do I make meaning out of suffering and death? Like those type of things. And one of the, when Nathan was saying, oh, he's doing this opening lecture on like the comic books helping biblical literacy, I was like, yes, because as a comic book nerd who spends lots of times as the weird minister that shows up at cons and is like, I'm a professional nerd, but I love comic books almost as much as I love Alfred North Whitehead. And the thing I wonder about our current context is, what do we do as a culture when we don't have ancient narratives and stories that have taught us how to ask those questions? Like, one of the challenges we have is, for a long time, you were born in a world and everybody had a shared narrative about where we began and where we're going. And then you had debates on everything in the inside, but it was in a giant shared sacred narrative. But now we live on a street where there are 5 sacred narratives and people that think they're stupid.
Right.
Right. So biblical literature, in one sense, even if you aren't a minister or whatever, is passing on the wisdom of a people that have wrestled with those big human questions forever.
Yeah, but and I want to kind of push back on this understanding or this idea of a large narrative that, in this sense, even throughout the Hebrew Bible, the narrative is constantly being rewritten.
Yeah.
Right? So you have the Genesis story, but you have the Genesis story reinterpreted in Ezekiel, and you have Ezekiel's narratives reinterpreted in Revelation. And it's through the generation of these stories, right? Generating these narratives that we find meaning, not just reading or drawing upon them, but looking back on our tradition, pulling it in, and then retelling the story. And if you think about kind of the theme that the dean started this podcast with, is These Bears Preach, right? That's what narrative preaching is all about too, right? You're drawing on this tradition of storytelling, and you're telling a new story for a new time that's drawing on this ancient tradition and pulling everything together. And it's those stories often that will move people to action more than just a premise. And that's why, thinking about, David Gushee's and Colin Holtz's book, these biographies of people, these stories, their narratives, that's what pushes people to move and to change and to try to be a better person in this world.
Well, one of the things I really love about what you're saying is that in nerd culture, no participant, once they connect to it via social media and going to their comic book store every Wednesday to pick up their new magazines and stuff, you realize when you say yes or no to your subscription in the magazine, it's telling the authors no or yes to, I like the story you're telling. When you engage with them on social media, you're giving input. But no one that's giving criticism in the comic book world is like, I hate comics. I'm done with comics. I'm a comic atheist. No, they actually think the genre is something worth investing in, and the community itself is telling the storytellers what we want to hear.
Yeah.
And I actually think it's a beautiful image to thinking about the Christian faith. That for a long time, in a world where you image the world in this great chain of being, from the absolute unchanging God all the way down to humans and then below it, unchanging rocks or whatever, then you are finding your place and performing it. But once you go into a story of becoming, where there's transition and emergence going on all the time, then the question is, what does fidelity look like in the next moment?
Right.
And comic book culture both has an allegiance to the story you've inherited and an insistence that if you keep telling the story I love, it better have something to say about the questions around justice, beauty, goodness that I'm asking today.
Yeah.
And the church is so scared to have someone inherit the beauty of its traditions and insist it has to talk about the stuff today.
Right, right.
That's why I think you should teach all my friends that left the church for stupid reasons Hebrew Bible.
That sounds like it'd be a great class.
And I do think it's there, right? Like because interpretation is either something you acknowledge happens or doesn't.
Right, right.
And then the question is, who are you interpreting with?
Yeah, and you paint a picture of comic book geeks as kind of this utopia.
No, they're also like horrible.
Yeah.
It's just comic book geeks have less problem ignoring patriarchal, homophobic a-holes. The church tends to put them in charge of stuff. But that's...
No. I would agree to a point, though. I think there's also a point where reading what the culture is saying about religion and what the culture is saying about faith and ethics is also holding up a mirror to the church, right? And in this way, comic book nerddom is no different, right? Because yes, you have a lot of great, wonderful creators who are embracing diversity, bringing different religious traditions into their comic books, bringing different conceptions of gender and sexuality into their comic books. But then you also have the fundamentalists, right? Who are right now trolling the Captain Marvel movie and trying to make it sink on Rotten Tomatoes.
And they didn't like episode 8.
Right. Yeah. They did that on episode 8. and so, of Star Wars, if you're following.
Yeah, because there's nothing else that has an episode number.
Right.
That's canonical.
So there is this kind of mirror of religious life and fervor that I see in comic book fandom, or really any other kind of fandom, whether you're talking about comic books or movies or sports. There's this kind of fundamentalist, maniacal kind of following that we're still all human and we're still all kind of gripping the same kind of selfish needs and trying to figure out how to make ourselves more important than we really are.
Yeah.
So,
okay. So one last question is, if you were in charge of like Vertigo Comics, so you have the permission for like a rated R comic, right? Like it doesn't have to go straight to DC or Marvel. And there's a biblical character who you thought, if it was told in the graphic novel, like so literally committed to the biblical text that it would make everyone obsessed with the biblical text uncomfortable, and they might not read it and tell their friends, but they would read it on the DL. And like progressive Christians, it might be so edgy they'd actually read the Bible because it involved pictures. And you're pitching Vertigo Comics. You're like, look, if you want to bring the people of the big old bippity bop bop Bible to comics, tell this character's story. Which one are you going to pitch to them?
Well, I don't know if you did any back research on me, but my dissertation's on Ezekiel.
No. Oh, I was hoping you were going to go with Ezekiel.
Yeah. And so, for Ezekiel, you know, if you haven't read Ezekiel lately, you may not want to. It is very, very graphic. It's got a lot of misogyny in it. It's got a lot of graphic sexuality in it. And that would be the most, I think, controversial depiction. But you mentioned Vertigo Comics, and they recently had a story about Jesus' return that was supposed to come out. That was supposed to come out, but it got canceled because it was too controversial. The premise of the return was that Jesus was going to come back and look and see what had become of his gospel and start correcting it. And that, I think, would have been fascinating, but our culture has decided to pull the plug on it.
Well, I mean, I've joined like 3 different Facebook groups that are about crowdfunding that comic, so I really hope they do it. And so thank you for sharing with us. Everyone give a hand. And yet decides to use the word Jesus to capture the beauty, truth, and goodness and justice they seek. Let us drink, let us celebrate, and let us tell our neighbor, I love you. Cheers.
Amen.
Thank you.